Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here this evening. We have the pleasure to welcome Aurélien Gamboni, who I will shortly introduce. We will have a presentation about 40 minutes and then an open discussion about the work. Aurélien developed a practice that is critical investigation, often involving field research, travel to different contexts, and mostly collaboration, multiple collaboration. This practice of a long-term inquiry is at the beginning always open-ended, which is kind of evident, but I want to put the emphasis on the long term because it really means a long time engagement. These projects run often over years. One, for example, is ongoing since 8 years. Starting point and engine of this inquiry practice is what Aurélien calls mediator objects, which can be images or narratives, and we will hear more about this tonight. In other words, the ones of Walter Benjamin, we could also describe it as images of thought, Denkbilder. Such mediator object was, for example, the painting The Conjurer by Bosch, which led him to and guided him to the question today's forms of manipulation in politics and the economies of attention. He uses different methods of investigation, ones from criminal, artistic, political, or social investigation. He collects numerous documents and testimonies which articulate and put in relation within different displays, installation, lecture, and performances. In this talk today, Aurélien will focus on his proceedings, which are strongly relying as well as generating narratives and collaboration. For sure, he will also give us insight in another long-term project, which he conducts together with Sandrine Teixeira, an anthropologist, in 2011, and which is taking Edgar Allan Poe's Maelstrom as the tool of his investigation. Why I'm so happy that Aurélien is sitting and showing today part of his practice here is because I think he has a unique ability to make graspable the potential of artistic research in the processes, not splitting a research and the outcome, but not hierarchizing this, but at the same time not declaring the process itself as artwork neither. So it's about navigating, triggering, entangling in an extremely honest, intelligent, precise, and subtle way different fields of action and levels of reception. To say something more about Aurélien's background, he had studied at the Head School of Art and Design in Geneva, where we met. He was also part of the MA program of experimentation in arts and politics at the Sciences Po Paris by Bruno Latour. He was a founding member of a collective called Safe as Draft, which is working on representations of climate change. And he is actually teaching at the Head School in Geneva, where he also participated and just concluded a SNF research project under the title The Anthropocene Atlas of Geneva. His works are shown in very different contexts, along with where he lives and works and researches, in exhibition spaces, like locally, like MAMCO or Centre de la Photographie in Geneva, but also in theater, in biennales, like the 5th Lubumbashi Biennale of Democratic Republic in Congo, Porto Alegre in the 9th Mercosur Biennale, festivals, such as the Indeterminacy Festival in New York, Les Urbains Lausanne, Festival d'Histoire de l'Art in the CS Paris, and many others. He won a Swiss Art Award twice in 2011 and 2016. And the other day, when we were Skyping for preparing this discussion, he told me, you know, it's funny because I'm always invited by, or often invited by institutions that are specialized in medium I'm not practicing myself. For example, the Center of Photography, as he's not a photographer, or actually a festival for sculpture, and he never did any sculpture piece in a classical sense. But for me, it's very clear why it's appealing to invite Aurélien beyond any disciplinary boundaries, because his practice is very inspiring. So thank you, Aurélien, for being here this night, and we are all ears.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and everybody organizing this event. I hope you can hear me well from the distance. I'm kind of struggling with cold for the past few weeks, so if you at some points you don't hear me well, just don't hesitate to say. So it's interesting because for me, it's not always extremely easy to evoke the diversity of the various projects that I'm engaged in, because developing an art practice that is based on a process of investigation means, as Laura said, that I will be embarked during several years on various projects which have their own dynamics and their own density, and also the fact that it implies collaboration. So switching from one to the other always is kind of a challenge. But most of the projects that I've been involved in have kind of a common factor, and it's the fact that they build from my interest in special kind of objects that have the capacity, I would say, to set the mind in motion. It can be a story, or it can be narrative fragment, a tale, it can be an image, a painting, and something that kind of allows me to grasp something of the world that we inhabit, and to grasp something of the transformation and mutations that are currently in process. It's an interest for certain objects that can haunt you, work on your mind, as I said. And I like to say that as artists, we often consider how we work on things, but that the opposite is perhaps even more true. Things work on us. And that's pretty much how I select the project I work on, is to base them on very singular objects, mediator objects that I will expose later, that have this capacity to work on me. So here I will mainly focus on two investigations. One that I developed individually, I might say, and that I will address a little bit more briefly as a kind of an introduction. And the other, which is a collaboration that Laura mentioned with anthropologist Sandrine Texido, who used to live in Brazil and now lives in Toulouse in France. So the first object that really sets me into an investigation process is this painting by Animus Bosch, Flemish painter, and that caught my interest for a lot of various reasons. I could talk for hours about this painting, and here I will not have the occasion to, so I will run a little bit quickly over it, which is a pity. But what I can mention is that my interest started to be raised by this image, because it's a scene that I could see at the time every day in my town of Geneva, just getting out of my door in the street. Groups of people playing this very famous cups and ball game, which is a very basic magic trick of having a ball appearing and disappearing between the different metal cups, or it can be used with other means. And it is usually practiced as a kind of fraud, of course. It's called sometimes a con game. And my interest started to raise in in kind of a context of the economical crisis, of a kind of a crisis of representation and the doubt that was starting to raise towards political representatives, but also aesthetic representation. Here it's one of the first representation of a magic trick practice as a fraud in the history of European painting. And it's, for me, extremely interesting to look at the way that it stages the attention dynamics that are at work in this particular trick. Having the conjurer showing the ball, having the victim kind of hypnotized, bending over the table, the victim who is even spitting frogs on the table, and having all the other person, I mean, first of all, the accomplice, just beneath the victim that you can see and who is robbing the purse. And then all the various persons with all of these very complex attentional dynamics until up to the little child beneath the victim who seems to be noticing what is at work here. And I started to develop a particular interest for the table in this composition that I like to see in a really anachronic manner and to understand it as a kind of interface. I started to wonder if this painting could tell us something about very current and absolutely contemporary dynamics of capturing, manipulating the attention, understanding the scene as a kind of, in the way that it can, yes, stage this kind of contemporary issue. It's also something that developed in dialogue with the theoretician Yves Citon, with this idea of questioning the current ongoing theories on the so-called economy of attention, which is characteristic of our present time, where attention is being more and more translated into value. And as it said, it constitutes kind of a new scarcity, almost like a raw material that will be captured, that will be refined, and that will be sold. So how can this painting tell us something about the way our attention is being targeted and how we might learn to develop some kind of defensive skill against the manipulation of attention? So I started to develop an investigation on the painting itself and its history. It's also very interesting because while collecting testimonies and clues, following the path of the very troubled fate of this painting, I discovered that it was extremely hard to see it because it's kept in a museum that is now closed. For more than 30 years, it's been closed. And so I had to ask difficult authorization to be able to finally come and see it. And realizing also the reason why this painting was not visible is because it had been stolen in 1978 by one of the members of the left army group Action Directe, Jean-Marc Rouillon, who had been, who spent 20 years of his life in prison. And I also went to meet him and try to understand why they had robbed this painting, which I kind of thought was in a way sort of a political gesture. I'm not unfolding too much around this one investigation here, but it's also a painting that has a long history of being referred to and used in a highly political context. In May 68, for example, also in regards to the creation of the European money, the euro. And so I went to meet him, hoping that it would be in relation to this robbery, a kind of a political gesture, which is what it was absolutely not. In fact, it was just a way to make money and to support the activities of the group. But this led to a series of lecture performance that were crossing somehow this narrative of the investigation itself with some of the theoretical implications that we could draw out of the very painting. and also led to different types of installation that were staging some of the sounds of the interviews collected.
Il y a un fait qui est amusant dans cette histoire, c'est que dès le début, par un infiltré qui le paiera plus tard de sa vie, la police était renseignée sur nos intentions, pas sur l'intention qu'on avait de prendre un tableau de grande valeur. Donc c'est une partie de dupe tout au long de cette histoire et l'équipe espère tout le début parce qu'ils sont persuadés qu'ils vont nous attraper sur le fait ou lors de l'échange et en fait ils ne réussissent bien. Et donc la seule chose qu'ils font, ils récupèrent le tableau. Dans la partie du dupe, c'est que les menées du début à la fin, tout le monde se retrouve sans rien.
The particularity also of this investigation is the way that in this process of collecting testimonies, clues, and meeting various people that were related to the fate of this painting, we were also together exploring the interpretative potentialities of the painting. It was really a painting that mattered for all the people who had been in relation to it. They could also see things, various things. So the idea is that understanding this kind of image as a conceptual tool, as a kind of reflexive tool, was a process that would happen together in discussion, not only with theoreticians, but with various people. The cops I interviewed who were trying to arrest the people in the street playing the cops and ball games today, the thief who robbed the painting at the time, the director of the closed museum explaining with strange arguments why this museum still cannot give access to this painting even still today. So this really for me raised the question about what it means and what it would mean to investigate not only on an object, but to investigate with an object, to experiment its agency in a situation of inquiry, its capacity to gather people, issues, and ideas. So can this image understood as a kind of conceptual or speculative tool become a mediation object in order to enter into contact with contexts and sites that are actually quite remote and in appearance unrelated? It would be possible basically to bring the conjurer in a totally different context and see what kind of way people would appropriate it, what kind of experience it would bring on the table, what kind of reflection and discussion. And so I had the opportunity to experiment this in the context of the Lubumbashi Biennial 2 years ago. But I will not talk about it today. I will now switch to another investigation, which really pushes a bit further this process of experimenting an investigation with a mediator object. So now we get to this collaboration with Sami Texido that has been going on since 2011. And so once again, we start from this kind of object, conceptual tool, speculative tool, to this time really to explore, I would say, issues that are related to the perception of environmental change and the perception of environmental risk in a context of climate change, in a context of ecocide, where profound mutations are occurring that often elude our perception. And so the tale in question, the story in question, it's a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, written in 1841. It's the story of, first of all, a narrator. We might say it's an investigator himself, being guided on top of a mountain, Mount Helsega. We are in the north of Norway, in the Lofoten Island, And he's guiding there to observe the phenomenon of the Maelstrom, which is a gigantic whirlpool which appears and disappears depending on the tide every 6 hours. And so he's being guided there by an old fisherman who will first show him the whirlpool and then tell him about his own story, how he once ended up being caught inside the Maelstrom with his 2 brothers and their boat. And in a very interesting manner, the story of the 3 brothers inside the whirlpool unfolds the way that one of them survives, and is the one who manages to overcome his fear and start observing all of the objects, other objects that are caught with him in the world, in the vortex. So you have many fragments of vessels, you have broken trees, sometimes you have whales and so on. And he starts to analyze their circulation, the circulation of these objects, and finally gain a better knowledge of the specific dynamic system that he's currently a part of. Managing to overcome fear, so he gets into a relation with this environment where he will kind of produce a mental representation of it, the very environment he's caught in. So he understands, he deduces from his observation that large and angular objects are more likely to get quickly drawn to the center of the vortex where they will be crushed, and that smaller objects, and especially cylindrical objects, tend to rather turn in circle and stay at distance from the danger. So he tries to convince his brother to follow him when he lashes himself to a barrel that was still on the boat. He doesn't manage to, so he jumps alone, and that's the way that he will survive. He changes the vehicle. So there are different ways to understand this tale, which is also very rich in detail in terms of a conceptual tool or kind of a conceptual model. And we produced some drawings that would help doing so. So this is, if you want something like this mental representation that the fisherman in a situation of risk will produce in situation, it's something like this. And it has to do, part of the issues we wanted to raise with that is, it has to do with the situation of being part of a dynamic system, which may at first appear as chaotic. You have many objects turning around. It lasts for hours. You cannot distinguish anything. It's kind of an image of chaos or of information overload, attention overload. Too many objects who are competing for his attention. And it's difficult to deduce any kind of pattern. Then he starts distinguishing certain forms and certain objects, tracing their trajectory. And in this process, he manages to find a way to escape. He gets a deeper understanding of where he is. Interestingly, some people also got interested in this tale and tried to understand it as a kind of model. Famously, Marshall McLuhan used the Maelstrom of Poe in his book, The Medium is the Message, published in 1967 with Quentin Fiore, the designer. And here he kind of like represents himself surfing the whirlpool of electronic information. So of course, way before the internet and the idea of surfing on internet existed. So we all know how premonitious McLuhan was on the topic, but still it's very particular to see the way that it is used here. So the issue is about being properly equipped, learning new abilities to survive a rapidly changing environment. So here, McLuhan addresses mostly technological and a media environment, which is changing rapidly. But it still raises very interesting question: how to pay attention to what really matters when we receive too many stimulation, It's also a question of media ecology, considering the environments of our attention, which are obviously also witnessing important mutation. Another model is the way of tracing the emotional response of the fisherman during his descent. Interestingly, it echoes the work of sociologist Norbert Elias, who wrote in 1983 his book, I will say it awfully, Engagement und Distanzierung, like involvement and detachment in English. And he also used post-Maelstrom as a kind of model, trying to understand how both individuals and societies can adapt to situations of danger. In this case, his biggest concern was the Cold War and the potential for nuclear catastrophe. For him, keeping emotions somehow at distance in order to take the right choices is crucial to be able to survive and avoid the catastrophe. So it's the situation of the fisherman overcoming fear and starting to observe, analyze, think, and so on. But when we start to have a kind of a closer look at the tale and the way that this emotional response unfolds, we see that it's much more complex, in fact. We go from a first response, which is horror, being terrified and paralyzed, and then to despair, abandoning all hope. It's a little bit like Dante's Inferno, right? Before going into the circle of hell. And then we get to admiration. He has time to look at the terrible beauty of the scene. It's kind of a sublime moment. And then curiosity, having the courage to look, kind of the amusement, to start to be playing with all these objects, trying to guess which one will go quicker to the bottom, and so on, and hope and anxiety. And so it's it seems to picture a situation where the emotions is not necessarily something that needs to be kept aside, but kind of participate to a progress or a process that helps this person get a better understanding and a different relation towards his environment. So then the investigation, the challenge for us was to find a way that we could bring this tale with us when we travel. So we started publishing little versions and finding translation that we can bring with us in our suitcase, and also bringing different stories with us that would somehow gravitate around this tale by Garpo, including those of McLuhan and those of Norbert Elias and other somehow trajectories of people who had joined, make some kind of alliance with this tale. And we started to build a project to make travels and to use it. So, as I said, as a kind of conceptual tool or mediator tool in knowledge, in investigation. So, the kind of a big question that we had in that kind of process of displacing this story in a different context and seeing how it would help us to think differently certain local issues. It related to the proposal of Donna Haraway that I quote here. It matters what matters we used to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what not, what thoughts, think thoughts, what ties, tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. Different investigation process started to unfold from this point. The first that we made was in Porto Alegre, in the south of Brazil, in the state of Santa Catarina, in 2013. We made several research residencies going at the encounter of various inhabitants of the city, but also various scientists or people engaged in the development of the city. And it turned a lot around major events of floods that had happened in the 1940s and that had totally changed the perception of the inhabitants' natural environment and of their lake. The city had entirely barricaded itself from the lake from that point. So the whole development of the city was marked by this event, which was not something that you could find so many information on. So investigating this meant talking with people who had witnessed these floods, meeting people who were in charge of the protection system of the city, engineers, meeting geologists, hydrologists, climatologists, and so on and so forth. First, I briefly mention this different investigation, and then I'll go a bit more in detail. Then we went to the Lofoten Island, which is the site of the Tale of Po itself, and where it has a lot to do with big controversies on the development of the oil industry in the Arctic region. In the Lofoten Islands, we are kind of like at the border of the Arctic, if you want, and it's one of the very rare regions which is now resisting this development. So there were many stories related to that. We pursued that process in the region of Niterói, which is a small city on the other side of Guanabara Bay in Brazil, on the other side from Rio de Janeiro. And that had to do with a situation of disaster with a collapse. A community living on a hill realized that they were actually living on a former dump that had been forgotten. And with the extremely heavy rain that were even said to be related to climate change. Apparently, the people who were displaced due to this disaster appeared in some of the reports on climate change, displaced people, which they didn't even know themselves, actually. And so half of the hill basically collapsed. And then more recently, we went to the region of Buffalo and Niagara Falls at the border of the USA and Canada. Mostly we were in the state of state of New York, Western New York. And that was the most recent investigation we meant, and it was a very rich one. It's an extremely kind of classical situation of a post-industrial context in the area that is called the Rust Belt, as we can imagine it, with lots of enormous, gigantic factories in ruin and places that are sometimes being transformed. Some new economical model like Tesla that come to develop in the region. But mostly it's kind of a feeling that we had to be kind of walking into this notion of annexing, of survival in a post-capitalist ruins somehow. A situation where countless workers have lost their jobs, amongst other in the steel factory, and sometimes commit suicide in the Niagara Falls. We heard stories about suicide in the Niagara Falls, and one particularity of that is that when somebody jumps from the Niagara Falls, the body is being plunged down at the bottom of the river, carried for quite a while, a long distance, and the very location where the body gets out, pops out, is at a place called the Whirlpool. There is a very big whirlpool at one turn of the Niagara River, which is a place actually where a film was shot about the Maelstrom of Edgar Poe, involving his son, Eric McLuhan, by a Canadian filmmaker that we also interviewed. We also, this kind of echoes also the researches that are led by a biologist of the Great Lakes Center that we interviewed, and who make a lot of research, of course, in the lake, but also in the rivers, and who found traces of antidepressants in the brain of the fishes in the river, which is the antidepressants, of course, that are being consumed and that get out of the bodily system through the toilets and then through the how do you call this, the sewage system. And so it also attests how much this medication are being used in the region. And so many highly contaminated sites are in the region, and it's a very strange feeling to be walking on what looks like a very basic hill right next to a school and knowing that there are nuclear waste being buried right under your feet. And some of the most important mobilization movement, environmental movement in the US started also because of some of this contamination scandals in the area. But interestingly also, some of these highly contaminated sites have now become nature preservation sites because the area is absolutely crucial for the migration of the birds from the Arctic to the Amazon. And we spoke to a lot of people engaged in this process of preservation, and it looks quite contradictory to use this kind of space for preservation of nature. But it's kind of the only space they have. And it turns out that this space is also apparently have a very, starts to have a very special kind of biodiversity, which is like reappearing in all of these abandoned spaces, of course. So it's a very rich and ambivalent context that the investigation started to make appear. And what is interesting maybe is that rather than focusing on one issue in particular, what starts to appear is kind of an entanglement of interrelated issues. We come and talk about Edgar Poe and talk about the Maelstrom and try to solve out in dialogue and in negotiation with each of the person we meet, what the issues that this story stages can mean actually for them. And we get very different results. And part of the interest also of that is that it's a tool that can work with extremely various people. And we really emphasize on the fact that we don't want to make any kind of hierarchy between academic knowledge or local or considered popular forms of knowledge. So it's really a tool that helps us work with as well a climatologist or biologist or an engineer or a fisherman or an activist. So in this process, progressively, the map of the inquiry gets populated by new issues and by new beings, and this is really a collaborative process with the people we encounter. Perhaps an even more exemplary investigation that we did was the one that happened on the site of Edgar Poe's tale itself, in relation to the real phenomenon of the Maelstrom, which is not exactly this huge whirlpool, but that seems to be still kind of scary. And I mentioned this kind of like dominant issue about the oil industry in the Arctic and the resistance and the opposition of the population against it, which is something rare enough to be mentioned and supported. So of course, we started collecting a lot of testimony about these issues, but there were also more unexpected somehow encounters. So obviously, when we learned that there was a former fisherman organizing touristic trip to go see the Maelstrom, we kind of had to go to see that, to be able to have something to show when we come back. And that's pretty much what we saw. Okay, so we saw absolutely nothing, as you can imagine. But not only was it extremely quiet, but the more we were approaching the place, the more fog there was, and we ended up really in a kind of like very strange, cloudy white light. It was pretty much a mystical experience of some kind. And of course, we were extremely naive to think that anybody would bring us with a boat on a place at a moment where it's dangerous. So they bring us in the moment of the tide where there is absolutely no risk. But we still had some things to see in the area. One of the things we saw were traces of former fishermen villages that were really under the high cliffs of this Mount Helsega, where the story of Po begins, and facing the Maelstrom, facing the open ocean. So in an area that is really much harder to live than inside the fjord. So it's really people who had to live and cohabitate with the Maelstrom on a very daily basis, which is something that was interesting for us. So we started also investigating on that aspect, realizing that these villages were displaced during the period of modernization of Norway in the 1950s, and that there were some kind of like, difficult also testimonies about that. It was a bit of a painful memory for a lot of people, this kind of displacement. And they dismantled all the houses and then rebuilt them inside the fjord. So we could also trace which houses were related to this past communities. And another thing we saw were these orcas, right? Killer whales that started to appear and to follow us and turn around the boat all along the trip. And the other tourists with us in the boat were extremely happy to be able to take picture of the killer whales. And so did we in the end. And a couple of days later, we saw that there was a specialist of marine mammals communication who was working in the archipelago, in the islands. And so we went to meet her. Her name is Heike Wester. And she was extremely surprised to hear that we had seen killer whales. And she started to say, I don't see them for months. I'm extremely worried. There's really a problem going on. And at that moment, she made us hear this sound. With this repeating sound, 7 or 8 seconds. And basically what Heike Wester does for practice in going boat in the fjord, plunging her hydrophone in the water and recording the sound of the waves. But more and more, it's not the sound of the waves that she records, the sound, this sound, which is a seismic sound. And we are extremely surprised to hear that there is traces, sound traces of seismic activities in the archipelago, because everybody tells us that so far the area is protected. There is a kind of a moratorium that is actually still today going on. And what appears in the end is that it's not the sound of the seismic, how do you say, forage, it's the sound of the seismic shootings. So it's seismic prospection, and it's happening hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from that place. And so for her, there is absolutely no possibility to protect the ocean, because there is no boundaries in the ocean, because the sound travels such distance and is affecting the waves in ways that are quite dramatic.
Imagine you come swim like you have always done, and all of a sudden you come to this area and you hear that sound. You don't know what it is. It could be an earthquake. And it's really low frequency. It's so loud. It's not a boat. They know boat noise. It's disturbing, but they know it. It's something that comes and goes. But where does it come from? What is it? And it does cover their communication, the same frequency, so it's masking communication in some of the whales. And I see it, they just go. The pilot whales for the first time this year they came, and then after 2 days everyone was there, they left.
So Heike Wester is talking about something like a sound wall that runs all across the coasts of Norway, and she wanted to invite the fishermen on her boat to have them also listen to the sounds that nobody wants to hear. And at the time we met her was a very particular moment because she was extremely worried, and also most of the environmentalist organization were not really working on that issue and didn't really want to hear that we're already protecting other waves in other locations, and it was not really a priority for them. So she was really like alone with this kind of issue that needed to be heard, and this has started really to change since then. Other also unforeseen or unexpected issues that appeared in that process had to do with the history of the Sami population in the area. Most of the people we contacted seem to think that there had never been any Sami actually in that series of islands in this little archipelago. And we also found this very interesting drawing, which is a huge map. This is only an extract of it. It's a huge map of all the Scandinavia with all the names of places written in Sami language. So it's a map really as a political identity gesture. And as you can see, the parts of the Lofoten Island is really empty. So once again, no history, no trace. But then we met with archaeologists who started to make research about the origin of the village's name in the place, discovering that they were connected to the Sami language. So which was one clue that they had been in the region. And we also came into contact with an American scholar who was of Sami descent and who made a whole investigation herself, coming in the Lofoten to trace the history of her family, and started to realize that there were many untold stories, many buried stories about the Sami in the region. This investigation in Norway led to a series of conference, lecture performance, a bit later on.
Svolvær, 10 février 2015. On part de Svolvær, 2h30 de route, arrêt de Kness. 10h30, on leur dit we need to go where? Voir le Maelstrom. On regarde les cartes. 11h20, on repart, sillonner la pointe ouest de l'île. Haut, Sorol, Heine.
I shorten it a bit also to mention this approach of lecture performance was both trying to raise the challenge of narrating the investigation process itself and the way we get into encounter with various being, people, issues, and at the very same time trying to raise something like an assembly. In this case, it was what could be called an assembly of voices.
Tale about petroleum fairy tale of Norway is that you choose petroleum, open up future ones.
Yeah, we speak about it. Everyone wants to know your opinion. Where are you standing?
If you choose petroleum, you might just as well say that narrow future.
People are forced to take sides. It creates a polarized environment.
But remember also that, like locally and regionally, there's a more or less a 50-50 divide, or it's a 30-30 divide. 30 yes, 30 I don't know, 30 no.
bit difficult to hear.
It's 10 to 12 hours one way. So, because you can't go along the coast. You have to cross the mountain over to the outside.
Okay, no problem. So to mention that this process of developing different forms of assemblies is a concern that we have developed all along of this project. So it could be assemblies on the very sites of the investigation, gathering together the people we had encountered. First of all, around this kind of new external object, which is the Maelstrom, to see what kind of problematics it could change, it could stage maybe a little bit differently. And also what we did in on the lake area in Buffalo to organize a boat tour, which was also linked to a call for witness of environmental change. Once again, having various kind of like both specialists and like any inhabitant of the city being able to bring their own personal kind of knowledge without any kind of hierarchy. Organizing an assembly in a very special community of fishermen near Porto Alegre, who, contrary to the situation of the city that is barricaded against its lake, it's a community of fishermen who are really living on the shores and develop a strong relation to the lake, and also organizing other forms of group situation and public situation in exhibition context, such as workshop of literary interpretation of the tale with French theorist Yves Citon, or like workshops that we started to do a lot that have to do with re-scenarizing the tale of Poe. We rewrite the story together with the people who are participating in it, which is kind of another way to also reappropriate it and relate it to everybody's own matters of concern. So the relation to also fiction is important, and it's also sometimes another way to kind of stage this assembly or forms of assemblage. In Porto Alegre, we wrote a short story of fiction that was another way to propose a trajectory within the investigation and the issues and people encountered. So really, it's this important issue about how we gather, what we pay attention to, and how we pay attention, which may have to do with this arts of noticing that has proposed anthropologist Anna Tsing, understood as a way to look around rather than ahead, and to cultivate a kind of vulnerability to unexpected encounters with various entities, objects, and issues. Some of the exhibitions that we have made have both been an occasion to stage the archive of narratives that we have been collecting, but also to be part of the process of further continuing the investigation. And the people who are visiting are often proposed to take part to this process. And so in this kind of approach of assemblage, the Maelstrom operates as a kind of attractor, and it obviously occupies a central position at first. It's the first occasion that we organize this movement and this gathering. But interestingly, once the testimonies and narratives are gathered, once the people are together, they start composing something on their own and develop their own relation. Which is why it was a proposal to use a little bit differently this term that was coined by Frederick Jameson of a vanishing mediator. We might say that the figure of the Maelstrom as a mediator object in the investigation operates in itself as a vanishing mediator. It gathers people, issues, and objects, and then it progressively starts to fade away, leaving room to the shared concerns and the interrelated issues that it helps to connect somehow. Maybe I will close on this. I will end with this last image, which is an engraving illustrating a theory by a Jesuit thinker of the 17th century, Athanasius Kircher, who had a whole theory about the Maelstrom. For him, a Maelstrom was kind of the entry point of a subterranean tunnel, kind of an underground tunnel that would run. There were several of them all through the earth. And so connecting with an extremely remote site, and you would have vast quantities of water that would be dragged from one place and get it out in the other. He even tried with this theory to understand the existence of rivers getting out of mountains. And so in itself, what we like to consider about this theory is that it's most certainly a very irrelevant theory of the Maelstrom as a physical phenomenon. But at the same time, maybe it offers kind of a relevant image of our own investigation, trying to approach global phenomena as they appear through local forms, but without having to rely on an image of the global that would kind of flatten the diversity and the complexity of the local knowledges and local issues that we encounter. So the big question for us, once we unfold these many different layers of investigation, is what kind of underground tunnels we can try to find and see what connects them. That is maybe not something visible.
Before I give also the word to everybody to ask questions, I would like to come back a bit more on the notion of the mediator object, because you use different words to describe this role of the images of thought, or the conceptual tool, or speculative tool, also, and mediator object, because somehow I think the conceptual, to underline so much the conceptual, is nearly reduced, a little bit reducing also what you have at the beginning of the whole inquiry, which is the artistic practice already, which you reactivate at a different moment. So yeah, I would like to ask if the mediator role of the object is something that is not also your own. There's the kind of mirroring going on all along between the object you're using and your own practice, which is doing a bit the same.
No, absolutely. I mean, in the case of the conjurer, it was a little bit the case, but with the Maelstrom, it was very strong. With Sandrine, we really didn't want to be in the situation of going to a certain context, a certain place, and capture the testimonies and bring it back. And then what do we do with it, and what kind of responsibility we have towards these narratives and testimonies that we kind of carry somehow. So the kind of way to introduce this external object, which is not ours at all, which has also a strong capacity to strike the imagination, to evoke many things, but also to stage sometimes complex issues and kind of reflexive problematics, helping people to think about the dynamics that they are part of, to reflexively think about the practice, about their knowledge, and do that with a story that you can tell, which is kind of like easy to listen to, and that has its own complexity. So somehow it's like the tale of Poe is a theoretical tool in itself. So maybe that's why we multiply the number of words we try to use to describe what it does as mediator objects, or reflexive tool, conceptual tool. But the most important thing for us is that in that process, there is really this story that does not belong to us, and that we can all be in a situation of exchange of knowledge around it. And also, we are not just the investigators taking the stories and leading. We tell a lot of stories in that process. The kind of interview we do, we tell sometimes nearly as many stories than the person tells the stories. So it's really an exchange process where, if it's a kind of tool, it could be kind of a Swiss Army knife. Every time we meet a person, there is a new, aspect to it that comes out and that becomes potentially useful.
But at the same time, the story itself is putting a lot of emphasis on affect and on emotional states, and somehow I feel like this tool is maybe the narration is often a dramatic that you construct throughout the deployment of it, depending on how you present it. You have also this affective layer of the narration, and the naming it conceptual kind of keeping a distance. So I was just wondering if you sometimes also emphasize this other quality that is in artistic practices that is touching on the emotion.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, certainly parts of the very surprising effect that it has is that sometimes, we were surprised to see that a scientist, after listening to our introduction and the first summary of the tale, and then starting to talk about himself or herself, start to talk about a memory of childhood instead of talking about the scientific practice at first, and gets to places and subject of discussion that probably the person who would never have addressed if we were, regular investigators coming to say, what's your job, what kind of representation you produce, or like that. And so this affective dimension is present in the tale, in fact, extremely strongly, because it's the whole descent to the Maelstrom is a very detailed description of how a person is affected all along. Nearly everything is written in the passive form, everything comes to the fisherman somehow. And it's even like his lids clench themselves, an emotion takes control of him. He's really like a receptacle. Most of the time he seems to be extremely passive. And so we can really trace, and it would be possible to actually modelize that even more in detail, about all of these different layers of affect, which are also physical affects. I mean, it's not just not only the emotional effect, and it's pretty much linked also. So yes, it's a strong. But for example, the little drawing, one of the drawing that I showed, which is tracing this evolution of the emotional response, is something that we bring with us. So it's something that is physically on the table, and when we talk to a person, and it's interesting to see how different people will react on certain aspects. So then we will start to give more details on that part of the story, on that dimension, and so on, because the person has an interest on that. And then we start to tell about our experience in related issues. And that's how, little by little, by going in return, we find a place where that tale can be of importance and of use for the person. But it's true that sometimes we tend to talk about it in kind of an instrumental manner, maybe a little bit quickly, because also even if it's a short tale that takes maybe half an hour to read it, it still bears so many details. It has its own richness, and it has its own agency, and it certainly eludes our capacity to get a hold on it. But it's not necessarily something that we see as a problem. It's rather positive. That's why we need other people to
No, I was wondering
see how it can operate.
maybe it's also something that you do without, unconsciously, also in order to access to different interlocutors that you, because it's easy to understand how you work, and then this infiltration, there is a kind of infiltration where you use artistic strategies that are not like this. We could also think a lot of these methods you use are used by many other disciplines too, but somehow it gets through the material and through the narration itself, it gets again this dimension of also an experience and a narrative developing right in the moment, unfolding right in the moment where you're in contact with all these different people. And it was also linked to the question of your self-conception as an artist. So, in what way you see yourself really as a mediator, rather than an activist or I don't know.
Okay.
Because you touch on many roles or many possible positions, and somehow I see your own role also like the mediator object as the artist. So
I mean, then the specific forms of engagement that this practice produces is sometimes for me difficult to exactly describe, but what's sure is that having this object kind of like in the middle allows me to, and allows us to be in a situation that we would not necessarily feel legitimate otherwise. And I mean, we can quickly see if it's irrelevant in a context, and there is no potential in it, and okay. But when the people start to really get a grab on it, it gets very strong and interesting. And part of a way to develop a form of engagement on some of those issues, which are often highly political issues, is also to try to think and consider how we can become like bearers of narratives that has been kind of like shared with us or given to us in some kind of ways. And maybe what is also particular in the fact of having this mediator object being a text of fiction and an art form is the fact that the contribution we get often take very interesting forms. I think maybe it gives, it raises the interest from the people we meet to also give their own narrative forms. And I think it's very interesting when you hear a lot of testimonies and there are these moments in a discussion where you feel that this is a story that has been told already several times. It's starting to take some kind of shape. It starts to get maybe a higher kind of autonomy in its form somehow. And so it's really meant to circulate somehow. And we also try to, it's something that I didn't mention, but try to isolate and coin down this moment where there is something like a little pepite, a little fragment that is really has its own powers sometimes. And that's also why for us in the end, we don't want to be in the situation of either in exhibition or in performance or anything to constantly bring everything back to the figure of the Maelstrom. After that, I think all of these narratives, they have their own power somehow, and so they compose something by that themselves.
I would like to open up.
Regarding the presentation, I have an example, and then perhaps I have a question, but it's more a reflection. Your question about now. I visited the Porto in 2007 August because of the time. There, the small biennial. I'm curious
yes,
if you participated, but this is like a question and what I'm trying to say. The curators, they like during one of the talks, or I cannot remember, they did an interview with them. They said that the environmentalists are struggling, like the activists, to kind of explain to the local community that like they have really to resist the oil companies who are desiring to drill there. And they said like exactly this, that because the biennial is very radical and local community is very much contributing because they're using temporary buildings, like they're opening directly their storages or the place where the food the boats are placed, and so they're very much involved. But they said like with the means of art, we cannot really convince them what it's all about. And they said that there is a street festival, like of the street theater movement, really good groups are coming, and they said like 2015, perhaps I will watch. Now it's by memory. An actor was singing like a performance, but this kind of street performance. How if the drilling company is coming, the sound of the drills will, the whales will gone and the fishes because of the sound. The sound is disturbing for them. And they're coming actually the whole, like from the region, because they have a microclimate. It's very warm for this area, like it's warmer than comparing to Canada and the other areas. And they're coming like fishes from Japan and like the whole Nordic during the period of making babies, the production period. And they said like this actor was singing like a kitschy song, but everyone from the community was crying, eating, grilling and drinking beer. They said, unfortunately, with all these serious species like Oliver Hessler or who else, I mean, like this kind of very serious art, I mean, like they appreciate it, they support us, but we cannot convince them. And it's becoming an actor who is really talking to the level of, and then they started to cry, and then like the community, it was a catharsis, like perhaps not the bitterness, but admiration is on the bottom of your scheme. It's just another meme, this all not horror but drama, kind of very affected, and then everything changed. Like they said now they're very conscious, perhaps because then this consciousness is very temporal, perhaps they will need another actor to come back in a couple of years. What I'm trying to say, like, I understand what you tried to say about this, like these small pieces that they perhaps can make a circle and resist for longer. Perhaps the art has this destiny, then this kind of very dramatic expressions that they can convince, but this is a temporary, very short path.
Thank you. It's very interesting and relevant. That it's true that many things that I did not mention about the area, including this microclimate, which is related to the Gulf Stream presence, which is why it's so mild, but it's even extremely strong because there is this kind of struggle partly between the fishing industry and the potential industry development. And the fishing industry here, it's something absolutely enormous, and it has been for centuries, because, as you said, all the fish come to spawn in the fjord from vast distance. So what happens is that there are some months of the year where everything converges here, everybody converges here to fish. But the thing is that they also have a way to dry the fish that is very specific to the region. They dry it without salt. And very old tradition to dry it, you know, this kind of wooden structure that is typical of the area. And this requires exactly this climate. Climate change is something that would affect also. So it's also part of the issue, but it kind of another way. So yeah, there is this density of problematics. It's already extremely the controversy level is already extremely high. So for us, we don't imagine being in the position of like bringing the politics into the game because it's already quite there. We talk with different people, some who are for the development of the oil industry and some who are like activists fighting against it. And it's quite interesting because there are a lot of really local activists. It's not the situation that you can see sometimes in some areas where you will have like the Greenpeace activists from Oslo coming to the region. And then there is also this kind of like other aspect that appears between the capital and the regional. So really local activists, and they developed their own form. There was a lot of forms that we were told about that were interesting. For example, this kind of special warning fires, which was Viking tradition, and sometimes they like replay things like that to go on top of hills and burn this wooden structure as a kind of Viking ritual of warning in that context. So there were different types of performance that they tried. Some had a good effect and some not. But I mean, for us, we really cannot claim to have an impact on the opinion of the, or at least not something that could be measured in any kind of way. But in relation with what you say about the person who was able to touch with the street art form, it's something that I would obviously value and think of high importance. But I also recognize that for us, we are very humble in that relation. I would say we are more in a practice that would kind of like somehow build its own public, if you want. So it's not something that we produce like an art form. We were not invited to one of this festival, Vienna Festival, so we had not the opportunity to try it. But the thing is that what happened mostly in terms of impact and exchange was this gathering of people. Sometimes some of them, strangely, in this region, didn't necessarily know each other or started to have a different view and understanding of each other's implication and engagement. And it's kind of like the little snowball effect that you cannot really measure, because it's more like being in a very close relationship with some people, and that you see that it potentially kind of expands a bit, but to a degree that we cannot measure. And it's kind of like part of the investigation process. But it's true that in Norway we were a little bit frustrated because we didn't really have the occasion to test as much as we would have liked this kind of lack of gathering or assembly experimentations that we did more later on. Or earlier on in Porto Alegre, we tried several, and later on in Buffalo and Niagara Falls. And yeah, I mean, it's all. I think it's mostly related to the fact that we had decided to go there. We were not invited. In Porto Alegre, we were invited by a Biennale. In Buffalo, we were invited by a festival. And Lofoten, we decided to go there. So we meet a lot of people, including people in the art institution and stuff, but they are very polite. They say hello, but we came by our own means. So the relation is quite different in that sense.
That you are referring to us and we, and I'm curious about the group. Who is to be us?
Yes, when ending up talking mostly about the Maelstrom, so the we is Sandrine. Yeah, it's the two of us. Sometimes with extended collaborations that I should certainly have mentioned, like in Buffalo, it was a collaboration also with Stéphane Verlet-Bottero, who is both a curator and a climate activist. And we are developing also further collaboration actually with him in the future. So potentially it will become a larger collective I don't know. For me, it was a bit strange because at some point, working as an artist, developing this collaboration, and then it started to be almost half of the projects I do. So it's almost half of my practices. This what is becoming like a collective, in fact, and half is yeah, my individual practices, if you want, or other collaborations. And yeah, I don't know. We are in the process of thinking about how much we want to formalize this as calling ourselves a collective or not. But I certainly cannot talk about investigation without saying we, because it's not just me.
Then I have one more question. I saw you work in different places in exhibition space, but also what for me was very striking was that you made attempts to translate it into a theater roof space, which you showed a small extract of the lecture performance. But it was really very theater inspired. It was not, for me, it was more than a lecture performance.
Okay.
So it would be interesting that you say something more about how you choose this format, or what was also the different experience to have a format of a theater piece where people are coming and sitting and know they're staying for a certain while, and the exhibition, which is so different as a possibility to translate a narrative or narratives, because there are so many.
Yeah. Yeah, good question.
But how did it come to decide to do this theater format, also to try this out?
Well, if I remember correctly, at first it was because with the other project, Investigation on the Conjurer by Bosch, I had experimented some forms of lecture performance, which were a little bit less, maybe less of scenography, a little bit, maybe. And so we were invited by this Théâtre de l'Usine in Geneva. And it was at the moment where we were designing this project of investigation in North Norway. So we kind of like combined it together and decided to do a series of performances before doing the travel, kind of collecting some of the preliminary material and issues we could think we would bring there, and what we could expect getting there, and then doing another series of performances that would happen afterwards, after the travel. And but I think it has to do with what you said in the introduction. I don't know why I'm being invited always in so different places. One of the next projects I'm doing is a triennale of sculpture in open air, and I've never done an open air sculpture in my entire life. And I don't know. And then I try to find a way. But it's true that I mean, to be honest, we struggle a little bit with the theater as a kind of special dispositive for the circulation of attention. I don't know. It's not so easy somehow. In the same way that in a white cube you bring a chair, it's like a sculpture. In a theater, anything you say sounds theatrical and dramatic, even if you speak just like the way I speak now. And so trying to work in that context was actually the toughest part for us, was to really break some of this, I don't know, rules in some kind of ways. For example, we, maybe I can show an image that would be more telling of that. We tear down the whole structure for Les Gradins, where people are seated. And we transformed it into, do I have a picture of that? I'm not even sure. Yes, that's it. What you see here that appears as a kind of screen, in fact, is the supporting system for the public that we absolutely retransformed. We put all the public flat, just like in a conference situation. I mean, mostly what we were doing is starting with kind of like in between conference. I would be a little bit more into conference and drawing, and Sandrine would be a bit more in a more narrative, maybe position, where she was reading her investigation journal. And then little by little, we would introduce some shifts and transformation in that dispositif that would become a little bit more, of a scenography. But the base for us was very much to have this kind of dialogical relation between more narrative and more conference. And right. And it's also an old, I don't know. Yeah. I'm very keen with retroprojector, the objects and the kind of lights that it has and the kind of images produced, which is so much more bright and captivating than the beamer that we use everywhere.
But it means that you react on an invitation, trying to translate your approaches into this format that is proposed. Also, for you were saying Porto Alegre and the Niagara Falls were invitations first,
yes.
And then you kind of explore the possibilities to find links with your investigation, which is quite impressive that you find so relevant elements.
I don't know. It's that's really the part where it looks easy. I don't know. It's really, for me, it's really the part where it looks easy, because staging issues about how you perceive environmental change and environmental risk. Well, it's maybe not good news, but it's something that you can find basically everywhere. And the fact of not trying to access that or address that at first as a global phenomenon, but seeing through very local forms of knowledge and of practices how it appears, the very local issues that it takes, is really something that I don't know. I think, at least for the experience we had with this relation with the story of Poe, it works rather easily. The effect of resonance somehow operates well, and every once in a while you meet a person who is not at all sensitive to it, and that's it. But
did you know already when you approached this story, or when you read it for the first time, when you decided to project around, did you know already that there will be this connection to the climate change?
No, that's interesting. Not at all, actually. I think what.
When did you realize?
Sorry?
Yeah, then when did you realize that?
It's for me, it's related to what I mentioned in the beginning. I like to work with objects that work on me and work on my mind, and it requires time for that. And so I think it first caught my attention, this story of Poe. It was kind of a relation in between the story of Poe and Norbert Elias, and the way that Norbert Elias was using it, and something that I didn't mention here, which is a biographical element from Norbert Elias' side, is that in, I think, 1942 or 43, I'm not sure he knew it exactly, around there, he went to see a speech by Adolf Hitler in Frankfurt as a Jewish intellectual. Going to see this mass gathering of Hitler was really, in the way he describes this in his biography, is quite amazing. It's really getting inside the Maelstrom, trying to understand the logic of his political and social environment as it is transforming. And so I think at first what really struck me, and the reason I remember the story, was the relation between the story of Poe, the way Norbert Elias tried to use it as a model, and the connection to his this kind of biographical resonance, which is kind of a clue that this tale could both work to help us conceptualize various kind of issues, but at the very same time that he could also connect to extremely specific experiences of life. And it remained in my mind for years without, and I did nothing of it. It was just somewhere in my mind for a very, very long time. And I think it's only starting around 2010, 2011, when I started to be more get more conscious and engaged on issues related to climate change, that I started to realize that this story had like grown on me somehow, but that it could become operative on this matter in a way that I had not at all suspected. So it's kind of like my comprehension of some of the important issues of nowadays kind of like join suddenly what I think this story could bring to the discussion. But it's interesting because now it's even like among the people we talk to or interviewed, sometimes also were people that we are in discussion with or we learn from. Or so we did an interview with Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist of science. We have a whole interview that we have not published yet, which is fascinating about the tail. And after we made this interview, he started to use the metaphor of the Maelstrom in like all of his conference during like a year. So it's interesting also to see how it spreads in a way. And once again, not at all in a way, it does not belong to us at all. It's so for us, it's something that's quite nice. And now it's because of Bruno Latour. Now that means it's definitely linked post-Maelstrom and climate change. That's obvious. Question being how to find your own barrel, how to make an alliance with an object when there are so many objects turning around, floating around. And yeah, that's pretty much also a question that's that keeps us thinking somehow. This kind of already challenge to pay attention to our environment, when there are so many things that are currently changing that we cannot perceive and we cannot see. And if we add to that the challenge of we can say our attentional environments, the technological and media environments, and in which it becomes extremely difficult sometimes to trace these objects, to make alliance with these objects, and to build relation with what matters to us when we are constantly distracted. It's basically become a condition of permanent distraction. So it's kind of what's also in play for us in there.
It's interesting, maybe because as you described how fishermen start to think very radical in a way. It reminds me of like Sherlock Holmes, this very deductive mind, which is kind of old-fashioned thinking how things can be done with the pure logic. And then if your investigation with like asking and listening to stories, this is different. And if you're drawing, or if we should do just like find how our environment works in a way as Sherlock Holmes or the Fisherman does, which I can like hardly believe or is kind of underlined. Or if there is kind of more maybe different level of emotional level or like, less logical.
Yeah, but it's particular here because the emotions are extremely present. It's part of the whole architecture of it, but they're addressed in a very logical way. And it's true that in the tale of Poe, it's like somehow this fisherman, very strangely, is like an investigator himself. He has an investigative mind, and the way that he extremely precisely describes his whole experience is like, it's basically, obviously, like if you had put Poe inside the Maelstrom itself. For us, it's interesting because it's part also of, I mean, every model to try to represent or conceptual anything has its own limits. And in these exchanges, sometimes some of these limits become quite apparent. But it's not something that kind of, I would say, closes the discussion. For example, in what people bring to us, sometimes we can get to extremely different types of knowledge. Extremely, I mean, it would be even hard to describe. When I mentioned the American scholar coming to Lofoten, trying to follow the tracks of the Sami family, Sami origins, this all came to her through a dream, basically, and was related to also a session with drums. And so there was a whole part that was like logical investigation process, and a whole part that was based on dreams and on something that she didn't describe in that way, but that would nearly appear as a kind of environmental memory. She was always dreaming about the mountains that she came to try to find. And I mean, that's not typical Po, that's not a typical investigation logic, but we get a lot of this actually. And it's not like it blocks, you know, these other types of possibilities of like knowledge production and experience and so on and so forth. Yeah.
But I think Po is all about it, because like he's always like investigating like criminal stories, but it's all about unconscious processes. Like in the podcast, for example, so dear to the Conceptual in Pileta, the seminar is with the title of the whole story, and it's very considered. So the space and all these unconscious relations are produced based on this.
No, it's true, but it's a little bit less maybe present in this tale than in other. It's more like fantastic stories. But it's true that you can also feel it there, and there is something also mystical beneath it that is present strangely and that appears from time to time. But I think the remark is very relevant, because the way that we proceed to an investigation based on a story that stages something like an investigation somehow already sets rather this type of approach. So I'm just trying to emphasize here that the fact that it's not at all close to other forms of approach. And actually, we meet a lot of investigators all the time. A lot of people we meet, they are in research of something, and they use very various tools, and we are really not the ones who will qualify or disqualify certain types of ways of knowing. Certainly not. I have to say, with this project, I've really opened my mind quite a lot regarding approaches that would be considered less rational.
Maybe we close here, but probably we'll go and have drink later. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aurélien.
Thank you.